Если говорить кратко об истории успеха человека, которого мы сейчас будем представлять и который займет нас интересной беседой в ближайшие 1,5 часа, то его карьера начиналась совершенно из другой области. Он сказал так: я пришел вообще-то в вино совершенно случайно. Начинал в сфере страхового бизнеса, и это было дико нудно. И дальше, волею судеб, он попал на наш с вами рынок, откуда, как известно, выходов нету. В 2003 году он создает собственный журнал, и начиная с этого момента стартует история успеха Нила Мартина. В кратчайшие сроки он набирает аудиторию подписчиков 100 тысяч человек, и с тех пор является одним из самых узнаваемых и уважаемых критиков вина в мире. Он родом из Великобритании и сейчас присоединился к команде Роберта Паркера, в которой он осуществляет самый важный надзор за самыми важными 2 частями света в нашей области. Это Бургундия и Бордо. Давайте поприветствуем Нила Мартина.
Firstly, thank you very much for Simple to inviting me to Russia. This is the first time I have been to Russia. And also, I believe this is the first time you've had a wine congress here. So I hope that after my speech, it's not the last one. What I'm going to talk about is I've prepared 3 kind of topics. The first on the trends that I see in wine. The second is looking a little bit at Bordeaux En-Primeur, a little bit of the history, where it comes from. And at the end, maybe a little bit on how I taste wine, basically how I do my job. I'm going to go to the first one. So the first thing I would say, and by the way, I was in Hong Kong last week, so I only had 1 hour to prepare everything. So it's more my kind of brainstorming, how I thought. And the first thing I thought was how wine has changed, and it changed to become a luxury brand. So I just took a photo of 3 bottles I was lucky enough to taste at the weekend in Hong Kong, because you can only taste these kinds of wine in Hong Kong now. And I was thinking how 20 years ago, when I started in wine, wine was just a beverage. It was something to drink, something to enjoy. Wine was not the sort of luxury brand that we have today, especially in Bordeaux and Burgundy. And then I can remember, for example, the first time that I ever drank a bottle of Petrus. Unfortunately, I wasn't paying for it because the bottle of Petrus was about my monthly salary. But I remember the feeling as the sommelier came out and he presented the bottle on the table, and everybody in the restaurant looking at our table, and so, turning the bottle so that everybody could see what we were drinking. And I was thinking, how it was an example of how wine is a status symbol and how it's become almost like a token of our wealth and our lifestyle, maybe. And for me, that's been one of the biggest changes over the last 20 years. I think what's interesting is when I think back to say even the early 90s, and the most expensive wines even in England were not even the Bordeaux first growth. The most expensive wines were German Rieslings, the very top German Rieslings. They were the most expensive wines. And then in the last 25 years, it's completely changed. And Bordeaux and Burgundy have sort of become the icon symbols, the status for of who we are, in a way. So I was thinking, what kind of wines have become the icons? And they are, the fairly obvious ones. We've got Bordeaux first. Bordeaux is always the first region that I think people come to. because in many ways Bordeaux is the easiest to understand. It's you know, a group of chateaux that's quite simple to understand compared to Burgundy, where everything is broken down into little parcels, and you have to learn what are the Premier crus, what are the Grand crus, who are the good growers, what kind of soil is in Clos Saint-Jacques compared to Lavaux Saint-Jacques, and what the hell is the difference between Clos Saint-Jacques and Lavaux Saint-Jacques. It's very, very complicated. So I find that people tend to come to Bordeaux first, and of course they learn the hierarchy, the 1855 hierarchy of the Grand Cru Classé. And of course, people want the best, so people will go to the first growths. And even more than that, they will go to the best of the first growths. And in 1855, that was Lafite Rothschild. So that meant when, for example, China started drinking more and more wine, they looked at the classification, saw what was at the top. Hey, it's Lafite. And, you know, 7 or 8 years ago, everybody in China was wanting to drink Lafite, and the prices went astronomical. But that hasn't lasted, that was only for 2 or 3 years. It's come down since then. But it was a good example of, I think, wine being a status symbol and somebody wanting the very, very best. And then after Bordeaux, people tend to move to Burgundy because they realize that actually Bordeaux is made in quite large quantities. Even the first growths make anything 10,000, 15,000, 20,000 cases of wine. And that's quite a lot. And then you come to Burgundy, and they make a very tiny quantity. Somebody in Bordeaux said to me recently, he said, why is Burgundy so expensive? I can't understand. Why do people complain about Bordeaux prices? Thank you. And I said to him, well, if you really want to understand, you need to go into your barrel cellar, and you need to empty all the barrels in your barrel cellar apart from one. And then you'll understand the kind of quantities you have in Burgundy. And he sort of started to realize that whereas in Bordeaux he has hundreds and hundreds of barrels, in Burgundy sometimes the growers have only 1 or 2 barrels to supply the whole world. And everybody wants it. And so for collectors, that rarity is something that they really crave. It's something that money can't buy. You can be the richest person in the world, but if you want a bottle of, let's say, Georges Roumier's Bon Mar 85, you have to be very, very, very lucky. And if a bottle comes at auction, you just raise your hand and keep it up there until the auctioneer says it's yours. That's the only way to get it. And so Burgundy has almost in some ways taken over Bordeaux as the kind of the wine that people want. In addition to that, you've got Champagne. Champagne is very, very popular in, especially in the UK at the moment. A lot of the Grand Marques, Dom Perignon, Cru, Cristal, a lot is traded in high volume through the UK to probably Russia and the Far East. And so it's not my speciality, Champagne. I find the bubbles get in the way and I just like drinking it. But Champagne is something that's in huge demand at the moment and is continuing for the next few years. And then selected regions elsewhere. I mean, I thought about what are the icon wines outside those regions, and they tend to be very, very specific. So for example, in Spain, you've got, say, 2, I would say, Pingus and Único Vega Sicilia. They are the 2 wines that everybody wants. Outside that, it's more kind of wines that people just want to drink. They don't have the icon status like Único or Pingus. And then you've got a few others. For example, in California, you've got Harlan Estate, Screaming Eagle. You've got these icon wines that are very expensive. And you've also got in China, for example, you've got a new wine, Aoyun. If I go here, Aoyun is pictured on the right-hand side. Aoyun is quite interesting. Aoyun is the new wine from LVMH, the super global luxury brand. And the vineyard is 2,000 meters up in the mountains in a very remote part of China. And it's quite expensive. I was in Hong Kong last week, so the price is about 350 euros for a Chinese wine. And this got me thinking about two different types of icon. These wines, I took this picture of Le Pen 82 on the left-hand side. Le Pen is quite interesting. Le Pen is a very expensive wine, but people forget it was very cheap for many years. And I've seen, I have a friend in England who was delivered 10 cases of Le Pen by mistake, and he didn't keep them. He sent them back to the supplier. That's something he regrets now, but at the time, Le Pen wasn't, it wasn't a popular wine. And I remember talking to Jacques Tiempon, the owner of Le Pen, and he told me that when he was trying to sell Le Pen, he gave a case of 1982 to the négociant in Bordeaux, to the merchant. Please try and sell my wine. Please try and find a market for my Le Pen. And he said he came back after 1 year, and as he was talking to the merchant, he could see the same case of Le Pen behind him, covered in dust with papers on top. The merchant hadn't even taken the bottles out of the case, he just left it by the window. And now the same case of wine goes for, I think, about £128,000 per case. So what that's an example of is how something like Le Pen, it wasn't an immediate success. It was very cheap, and then its reputation grew naturally. Of course, it was helped by my boss, Robert Parker, who gave it, high praise. But even the 82, he only gave, I think, 88 points when it first came out, so he wasn't really behind it. But Le Pen's a good example of an icon wine that over time has become more and more in demand, very gradually, very naturally. And now, of course, the entire allocation is sold out within, 1 minute. Iüne is very different. It's almost the reverse. So it's almost like somebody has thought, right, we need to have China's most expensive wine. So when somebody goes into a shop in Beijing, Shanghai, Hong Kong, and they say, I want the most expensive Chinese wine, they'll just reach for this wine and give it to them because it's expensive, therefore it must be good. And it's been very successful. The demand has been very strong in China. And I actually got to taste the wine last week when I was in Hong Kong. And to be honest, it was pretty ordinary. It wasn't bad, but if I had 350 euros, I'd spend it on something else. So that's a sort of case where, nowadays people want to make icon wines immediately. They can't afford to wait. They spend millions and millions and millions of vineyards in promotion, flying over your French consultant who spends 2 minutes looking at the vineyard and then flies back. So they've got to pay for all these things. And so you need to come in at a very, very high price point. And there's many sort of examples of this. I mean, you could look at for example, the Vin de Garage in Bordeaux. Those wines had no track record, not much idea of terroir, but they came in at very high prices, and the idea is very simple. It's expensive, therefore it must be good. And I guess in some ways that makes us critics important, because we're the ones that go in and say, hold on a moment, this wine is expensive, but it's maybe not quite as good as the price suggests. Or sometimes, yes, this is a great wine, it's expensive, but it's worth the money. That's part of my job. But sometimes it's difficult when you have a winemaker with a very expensive wine, and sometimes their egos are quite big. They're very successful maybe in another industry before, and you go in and say to them, I don't think your wine is very good. They can get a little bit angry, and you get emails saying, you're not coming back to or you don't understand my wine, is the usual response. And I always come back and say, no, I understand your wine, I just don't understand your price. But that's something we'll see more and more sort of wines like Iüne in Burgundy. I've seen some examples where a new producer has said to his importers, you can only have my wine if it is more expensive than Armand Rousseau. Okay, so that's the condition set. So it's something that we're going to see more of in the future. So I was thinking also second labels. Bordeaux, we've seen more and more second labels like Le Faute de la Tour, Le Petit Mouton, Reserve de la Comtesse, and so on. I think when I thought about this, second labels, the idea is to deselect, take away parts of the vineyard to improve the Grand Vin, or maybe take out some barrels to improve. And then sometimes you could be cynical and say, well, they're trying to reduce the supply of the Grand Vin to increase the price. Like I said before, Bordeaux, it likes to create the idea that it's a very rare wine, but it's not. It's a mass-produced wine in many ways. So you need to create that scarcity. And one very, very efficient way to do it is to create second wines and to make them a large percentage of your production. About 20 years ago, second labels were a very small quantity. They would be maybe 10, 15% of the production. Now sometimes the Grand Vin is only 30% of the vineyard sometimes for the first growths. And then you have to ask yourself, well, then is the wine a reflection of the terroir, of the earth, or is it a reflection of somebody deciding that they want to create a style of wine in the winery by taking away some parcels or taking away some barrels? But I think in Bordeaux at the moment, we are seeing a lot of chateaux promoting their second wines, sometimes their third wines. And usually they say, well, you know, if you can't afford the Grand Vin, the first wine, then you can have the second wine. That's something I feel a little bit, you know, I have my own pride. I would like to think maybe sometimes I am worthy of the Grand Vin and don't have to drink the second wine all the time. But at the moment I do. So. But yeah, so second labels, I think we're going to see more and more of, and we're seeing more and more chateaux using third labels and even fourth labels, and we're going to see more of that in the future. And then I got to thinking about profit. One of the big areas at the moment is who deserves to get the profit when you make a bottle of wine. Bordeaux, Burgundy has become very, very expensive, so who gets the money? So should it be the winemaker who makes the wine, or should it be the merchant who sells the wine, maybe takes the chance to store the wine in his cellar and try and promote the wine? Should it be the consumer? The consumer, we are the ones spending our hard-earned money on the wine. So maybe if we buy the wine and then in 10 years' time it becomes more expensive, then we deserve the profit because we spent our money on that Bordeaux or that Burgundy. Or then is it just the investor? One of the things, you know, we've seen over the last, say, 10 years is more and more investment funds. So there was a case recently, I saw it on the news, where there was a big divorce case in California where somebody was buying hundreds and hundreds of cases of Latour and Lafite and Petrus, and there was a big divorce proceedings because his wife wants half the cellar. But the one thing that I noticed was they said that he never drank the wine. He doesn't drink wine. So he's just sitting on hundreds of cases that he doesn't drink. And I've heard this a lot. I remember being at a tasting actually of Le Pin, and I was sitting next to the biggest collector in the world, he told me, and he had Magnums and Jeroboams of Le Pin, every vintage. And I said to him, what is your favorite vintage? And he said, oh, I don't know, I don't drink it. So I said, well, why do you buy it? He said, well, it's expensive, and it goes up in value. So that was the reason. And this is something that's, you know, in the last 10, 15 years is the big question. How much of those expensive wines are actually drunk? You know, the simple answer is a lot less than 20, 30 years ago, a lot less. There are huge investment funds around the world that are buying hundreds of cases of first growths, and they will sit on them, and they do packages for people, promising to make 5, 10, 15%. And this is a big problem. In the UK, we have some investment funds that are good, and we have some people who take your money and then they disappear after 6 months. And you haven't got your wine because it's not finished yet. It's, you know, you buy it En-Primeur, it's not done. So you lose a lot of money. So this is something that we've seen a lot more in the UK and elsewhere. But you know, these kind of people that promise you to buy lots of Bordeaux or Burgundy, and you'll see 20% profit in 3 years, but they disappear after 6 months, and it's very difficult to get your money back. But again, it's one of those sort of, one thing that has happened is that one reason the chateau have put their prices up is because they look at the secondary market, so people selling their wine, and they look at the prices and they think, well, hold on a minute, I sold that wine for 100 euros, and here is somebody selling it for 1,000 euros. So somebody's making 900 euros and I'm only making 100 minus my costs. You know, what do? They don't go in the vineyard and spray the vines and when it's raining, or they don't worry about the hailstorm, or, you know, like we've seen in California, the fires they had yesterday. So, of course, the winemaker thinks, no, I'm going to take some of that profit. I'm not going to sit here and let somebody else take it. And so you've seen in Bordeaux quite a lot of people, quite a lot of chateaux have increased their prices a lot because they feel that they make the wine and they should get the profit. But then again, the merchants come back and say, well, hold on, you know, we invest in you. We invest in your unfinished wines because the wines aren't finished En-Primeur. And so we risk our money. You know, it could go down. There could be a big crash. So we need to see some return on our investment. And one thing you find, like En-Primeur, is that the money made by the merchants is very, very, very small. It's usually, for most, if you take the average, it's probably only 2 or 3%. So it's a large volume. When you see the figures for Primeur, they sell millions of pounds of Primeur, but the profit is very, very, very small. So at the moment, there's a kind of not fighting, but like a tussle between the chateau and the merchants who deserves the money. But it's interesting if you take an example like Domaine Coche-Jury in Meursault, their wines are very, very expensive. If you go to a restaurant, a Corton Chalman is 1,000 euros, 2,000 euros. But actually, the price from the seller is very, very, very cheap. I think it's about 150 euros, not much more than that, because he feels that that's the value of his wine. He doesn't care about other people making money. He wants to be very loyal. But usually it's the other way around. The winemaker wants to see that money. He's got a new Mercedes he wants to buy, so he needs to charge more money. One other thing I was thinking of about luxury brands as well is people see, or the chateau, the winemakers see their wines in the same category as, let's say, you know, a Ferrari car, a Rolls Royce, Prada, Gucci, you know, all those sort of fashion icon names, and they see their wine in the same kind of group, the same kind of a luxury item as those. But there's one big difference, and that is that wine is still at the mercy of Mother Nature. So you can say to your shareholders, oh, our wine is fantastic, it's got high scores, it sells for a lot of money, and then on the same day you could have a hailstorm and it could destroy your whole crop. That doesn't happen with most other luxury items. You know, there's a factory that's producing cars, and there's a factory that's producing expensive handbags, and if you want to create more or create less, you just press a button on the machine and it will do that instantly. With wine, you can't do that. You know, you are at the mercy of Mother Nature. And so this is one of the kind of interesting things where a lot of chateaux and a lot of winemakers who have expensive wines see their wines as that kind of luxury brand that should be sold at a high price. But the problem is that your quality can't be guaranteed. When I buy a Ferrari, no, not when I buy a Ferrari, I'll never buy a Ferrari, but if I was lucky enough to buy a Ferrari, then I expect it to be a certain standard. But with wine, you can never ever guarantee it because it's nature, so you can't control it. And sometimes I think, especially when I've seen some wealthy people buy a historic domain and they expect their wine to be getting 100 points every year and everybody loves it. And then people start saying, well, the wine's not as good as last year. They can't understand it because they don't quite understand that the weather or a mistake in the vineyard can affect their wine, and there's not much you can do. And this is kind of one example. I took this photo. This is in Stellenbosch in South Africa. And this is where the fires 2 years ago destroyed a lot of the vines. You can see the black sort of in the distance. That's up by Vekeleken, a beautiful part of South Africa, but destroyed by the fire. And I spoke to the winemaker. The winemaker, had to get up in the middle of the night and was trying to literally fight the fire with his, on his own. And he said that he got out of his car and the wind blew the door shut and slammed his fingers in the door. So while he had the fire, he broke all his fingers at the same time. So it's not easy. And I took this photo before the fires in California yesterday. I don't know if you've seen in the news, but in the news there's been devastating fires that have destroyed a lot of vineyard, and even my editor at the Wine Advocate, Lisa, had to evacuate her house with her children late last night. They told her to get out because her house was at risk of catching fire. So at the moment, I don't know whether my editor is homeless or not, so I haven't heard from her. But hopefully she'll be okay, I'm sure. But I mean, it just gives you an example of, like, last week you could be touring around these beautiful vineyards and seeing how fantastic they are, and then a few hours later it's completely destroyed. And that's kind of wine. It's a risky business, even when it's very expensive. You could have frost, you can have hail, you can have floods, and as we've seen here, you can have fire. And it's something that, it doesn't matter how expensive the wine is or how much care you take or how powerful you are as an owner, Mother Nature's the boss. That's true. And then I was thinking, are you the right person to drink my wine? This photo, I took this Saturday night. And this is my kind of tasting group in Hong Kong. So I was tasting with this group, and then I jumped on a plane, came back home for about 6 hours, and then came back here to Moscow. These people here, they're like, they're very wealthy people. Very, very, very wealthy people. And these are the kind of people that a lot of winemakers want to be drinking. They don't look like very rich people because they're off duty, but and that's towards the end of the evening when we drunk a lot of wine. But a lot of chateaux, a lot of proprietors with expensive brands want the right people to be drinking their wine. When I started in wine 20 years ago, even the first growths, I could buy them in a wine shop down the end of my road. In a normal wine shop, usually a little bit higher, I could buy Chateau Margaux, Chateau Lafite, Latour. And if you go back in time, in UK we have Odd Bins, which is a range, of shops all around the UK. You can go in there and buy, a Gallo, or Zinfandel or something. 20 years ago, you could go in there and buy Penfolds Grange, Hermitage from Charves Hermitage, all the first growths, even maybe Domaine de la Romani Conti, and you could buy that in a shop. That would never happen now, because if you got an expensive wine, you want it to be exclusive. So you don't want it in supermarkets, but you want it to be in Michelin-starred restaurants, and you want it to be going to the right kind of people that are sort of kind of glamorous, connoisseurs, quite wealthy. And there's a lot of the chateau now. 20 years ago, the chateau didn't really care who was drinking their wine. So they sold the wine to the negociant, and then, okay, it's your job to sell the wine. But now the chateau are much more interested where their wine is going. I remember like DRC in Burgundy, and they number all their bottles. And then sometimes I would post a picture on the website of, okay, I drank a bottle of La Tâche from DRC, but then they would look at the number on the bottle and they could instantly tell who had sold the bottle and where it came from. And so nowadays, people are very, the chateau owners, the winemakers are very interested in who's drinking their wine, which restaurants it's in, and they will take action. They will do something if they feel that it's not in the right place. And I know many, many occasions when a merchant has received a phone call and they've said, stop selling it to this person, we don't want you to sell it to this distributor, and if you do, we will stop your allocation. So that's happening more and more. This, by the way, this is a good example. This is in Hong Kong. They were drinking 25 vintages of Chateau Latour back to 1908. So that's why everybody's looking very, very happy. And why I was a little bit drunk on the plane. Oh, hold on. Oh yeah, and there's a picture of all the bottles. And so Hong Kong is really, I was talking about this last night, Hong Kong is one of the places at the moment that's drinking all the world's fine wine. If you want to build your cellar of Bordeaux, Burgundy, buy as much as you can now. Because I think in 5 years' time, 6 years' time, there'll be, I won't say there's none left, but it will be almost impossible to find these old vintages because they'll all be in the Far East. I'm sure some in Russia too. But I think we're coming to an age where the golden age of drinking old Bordeaux and old Burgundy is almost finished, very sadly. Because a lot of friends said to me, you know, all these old cellars that were in somebody's home for many, many years, they're all gone. You know, they've all disappeared. And the people that are buying these wines now, they won't sell them. You know, they won't go back onto the market because usually they're very rich and they don't need the money. Before, these kind of wines were sold by people that weren't so rich because the wines were cheap. And so they needed the money and they sold the wines. But now, these people who own the wines, they're much more wealthy, so they don't need to sell them, so they'll just keep them. And hopefully drink them, but maybe not. Oh yeah, and that's what we drank. It's a bit embarrassing, so I've gone across quickly. And there's a counter-reaction to all this. You know, all these amazing wines, very expensive, and the people drinking them, you know. There's a counter-reaction against it. So I was thinking what kinds of things that was. There's the natural wine movement. So this is kind of the natural wines are being drunk by younger people, by trendy, by hip sommeliers around Paris. It's, you know, how do we define natural wines? It's a very, it's a hot topic at the moment. You know, if we say natural wine is a wine without any SO2, then a lot of these wines are being drunk in wine bars around the cities and sold to younger people because that's what they can afford. And they like to think, you know, for people getting into wine, it's they aspire to drink something that's very now, very hip, very trendy. And so natural wines have taken off a lot. I will give you my very brief view. I like natural wines, but I don't like the way that natural wines have become a political subject. I don't like, if I go to a restaurant, I want to see a sommelier list with some natural wines and some wines that use some SO2 or have a more traditional winemaking practices. I don't like to go to a restaurant and the only wines I can drink are what somebody else has decided for me. And so I have had a few arguments with sommeliers who about natural wines when I go to Burgundy a little bit. But for me, I like some natural wines, and some natural wines taste like cider, and I'm not interested. But also, you know, we've got like people looking for new wine regions. I mean, you could include China as one of them. One of the things I found out last week in Hong Kong is that there is huge demand in China for Chinese-made wine. There's huge investment in planting vineyards. It's a huge country. I'm sure they have got some very good terroir to make very good Chinese wine. It will take some years, but you've got a lot more countries now who are making wine. Even England, we make wine in England, even though people in France laugh at me when I say that England makes wine, but we do make some good sparkling wine. So I think we'll see in the future like a lot more. I'm a big fan of, for example, South African wine. I think it's going to be, it's probably, somebody asked me this morning, what's the most undervalued wine region in the wine country in the world? And I would say South Africa is near the top of the list. Just an amazing country. A lot of rubbish, but when it's good, it's really, really good. The other thing I think is stories behind winemakers. So I think a lot of, especially younger people and a lot of consumers, they want to know who is the winemaker, what kind of person are they, how did they become a winemaker, what kind of person are they like. Just give me something, a human element to this wine. And this puts Bordeaux at a bit of a disadvantage. This is one reason why people have gone to Burgundy, because when you buy a bottle of Burgundy, you see the name on the label, and you can go to the vineyard and you can meet that winemaker, and he's out in the vineyard and he's spraying the vines. Bordeaux is very different. Bordeaux is more a brand. So it's just, if I say, you know, let's say Chateau Piche-Lalande, people know Piche-Lalande. But if I say, well, who makes the wine? Most people won't know, you see. But people want that information. They like the idea that they can look at a picture and say, that's the person that makes my wine, and you know, he looks good or she looks good, and I'm interested in that wine. And that's become more and more important, I think, in recent years. And I think, especially in the new world, you see like a lot of media focuses on who the winemaker is as much as their vineyard. And as a writer, I find it more interesting to write about people than the vineyard. It's interesting to write about a vineyard, but a winemaker is usually a far more complex person than the vineyard that they farm. The final thing I was thinking was, I was thinking in the UK, we've seen a lot of, especially younger people, moving either not drinking anymore, which I think is a little bit sad, because when you're young, that's the chance you get to get drunk and not have lots of consequences the following day. But a lot of people, and including France, are drinking a lot less than they did 20 years ago. And if they do drink, they've moved away, a lot have moved away from wine. Gin has become very popular in the UK, vodka as well. Another one is craft beers as well, like microbreweries making very small quantities of craft beers. That's become very popular in UK and also very popular in the US as well. So I think we are seeing people move away from wine. I don't mind that so much. I said to somebody last night, I think wine is something that people should drink when they're a little bit older. When you're younger, just do lots of stupid things, go to parties, travel the world, be stupid. And then when you're older and married with kids, then you'll need that glass of wine at night and you can get into wine. So I once wrote that wine is like jazz. You should get into it when you're a little bit older. Reserve it for when you're older and not so much when you're young. So sometimes when I hear about people trying to attract millennials into wine, I think, leave the millennials alone. Just let them party. Because when they're older, they'll have lots of time to appreciate wine. That's just my view. So various consumer issues, I just go through its alcohol levels. People want lower alcohol generally speaking. We're moving into an era where, especially in the UK, you have a lot of big buyers who specify, I don't want a wine over, say, 14%. It's not true all the time. I remember being in a winery where I was telling the winemaker that I looked for finesse and elegance in his wines, and then in the tasting room next to me, this guy was saying, I don't drink wines below 16%. And I thought, okay, well, everybody's different. But I think people are looking for elegant, more terroir-driven wines. I've certainly seen this change in Bordeaux in the last 5 years or so. People have moved to more elegant wines. They're not picking salate. They're not using so much new oak. So there's quite a big change going on, and it's continuing, and I think another 5 years we'll see more and more of those wines. And yeah, changes in winemaking, earlier picking, more selection in the vineyard, less new oak, and more acidity in the wines. People want freshness. I think for me it's always important that when you drink a wine, you want to take another sip afterwards. I think people always make the mistake of when they're just tasting wine and it tastes very fruity and it's very, very seductive. But actually what a wine should do, it should say, come back, drink more of me, and you never get tired, or you might get more and more interested, and then the bottle's finished. And that's what a wine should do. It's not about drinking a tiny amount and then you get tired. That for me is a failure. And if I taste wines like that, I don't score them so highly. And this is just touching on what I said before. People looking for more winemakers, we're looking for more personalities in wine, looking for stories behind, and that affects my job. I like to write about people, so it's good for me. I'm not someone that just likes to do lots of scores. That in some ways that's the most boring part. I like to write about the winemakers, and I think people are looking more for that, and for fine wine to be artisan and handmade. They don't want a big factory producing a huge quantity of wine. They want something like if you buy a tailored suit, they want something that they feel is somebody's taken a lot of care to make. And I think we will see more and more of that in the future. And also the presentation of the wine is very, very important. If you think about champagne, they spend millions and millions on launches for their champagne. It's all glitz and glamour. And it's crucial for champagne. And also the labeling, the marketing's become very, very important. I've just done, a picture of Mouton Rothschild here, which is probably the first example of somebody recognizing that the bottle has to look good. And so Mouton is a great example with an artist on their bottles each vintage. So the labeling, I think, has become more and more important in wine. And I think we'll see more and more people looking at how to make their bottles different, how to make their bottle very attractive when you see it in a shop. And it's true that a lot of people buy wine by how pretty the label looks. So they don't look at scores, or they don't look at tasting notes. It has a pretty picture on the label, and that's what they buy. And I wish it wasn't that way, but that's the truth, unfortunately. And the other thing, natural corks, alternative closures. So I'm seeing a lot more people using screw caps, diams, something that's not natural cork. In New Zealand, nearly every wine now is not under cork. And one of the interesting things in Burgundy is recently you've had some very, very famous domains have moved to alternative closures, so Domaine Le Fleuve and Domaine de Comte-le-Fond. And this is a very important thing, because many years ago I said, when those famous names start moving away from cork, you'll see other people will follow, because the stigma will disappear, just like it did in New Zealand. In New Zealand, they went from corks to screw caps almost in like 3 years. It was a sudden change. Once somebody moves, then everybody will follow. And I think we will see, especially in Burgundy, more and more producers moving to closures such as Diam. And personally, I support it. I've had enough of corked wines, expensive corked wines, or wines that I'll never taste again, and it's corked. And I'm getting a little bit tired of it. And the tastings I have done, I can't tell any difference between natural cork and Diam. So personally, I think we'll see more Diam, and I think it's a good thing. And especially if you're a merchant, you get lots of bottles sent back. It can be very damaging financially. So I think merchants will welcome it as well. And mature vintages. One thing I have seen is a lot more people looking for older vintages. I was at a dinner recently where we were drinking 3 vintages of En-Primeur, 85, 86, and 88. And we worked out that those 3 bottles were cheaper than the 2010. So what's the point of going and buying a very young En-Primeur when you can buy 3 vintages that are much cheaper? And I think a lot of people are moving now towards mature bottles, mature wines, and that's going to be a problem for En-Primeur. During En-Primeur, the merchants say to the chateau, it's difficult to persuade somebody to buy the new vintage because your older vintages, they're available, they're mature, they're ready to drink, so it's difficult to tell somebody to buy a young vintage. So we'll see more mature vintages, and that's why they're getting harder and harder to buy. When I was buying for Japan, I bought mature vintages all the time, hundreds of cases, and they were all drunk almost immediately. I just picked this out. This was quite interesting. This just shows how the price of the 82 vintages has changed in recent years. This is from Livex. And you can see here, it just comes back to my first point, the price of Lafite shot up in 2009, 2010, much, much higher than the other first growth. But at the same time, you've seen the price decrease since about 2011. So I think this is something that the prices are still very high, but you can lose money on wine as well. If you bought Lafite in 2010 at the top of the market, you would have lost a lot of money. But you can make a lot of money as well. Don't forget, the 82 vintage, the wines were sold for about 25 euros a bottle, something like that. And I know people that bought 100 cases of Mouton and they made a lot of money. Unfortunately, I was only 11 years old, so when I was at school, I instead of learning English, I should have been learning about Mouton Rothschild and Robert Parker and investing in first growth. Unfortunately, I wasn't, so bad luck. And just tied in with this provenance, where has my bottle been? If you're spending a lot of money on a bottle of wine, you need to know who's kept it. If somebody has kept their bottle next to the oven for 20 years, it's not going to taste good. And this has become a big business, And one thing I've seen is that now a lot of people, the provenance is almost as important as the wine. So you've seen, especially in the Far East, a lot of sales have been ex-chateau, ex-domain. And people will pay any amount of money if they know that the bottle has never moved from the chateau. And so I think 5-6 years ago, people, they just wanted a wine. But now they want a wine and they want to know where it's been, and it's become more and more important. And I saw this in Hong Kong last week. People, all the bottles came directly from the chateau. And of course, tied in with this is there's more and more fraud as well. There's recent figures I heard that 20% of all fine wine is fake. I don't quite believe that figure, to be honest. It depends where you buy your wine. If you buy a Rolex watch, you buy it from a good jeweler. If you buy it from a guy standing outside in the street, then you expect it to be fake, and it's the same thing for wine. If you buy fine wine from a good merchant, I'm sure it's going to be, it's not to say it's 100% real, there's always going to be some fakes that appear, but I think the percentage will be very, very low. I don't think it's 20%. But certainly, fraud is a big problem. I've seen a lot of fake wines. I've been at dinners where they've poured me like an old vintage of Petrus, and it tastes like a very young Rioja. And they say to me, Neil, what do you think of the wine? And it's very difficult when the person has spent, $10,000 on a bottle, and you say, it tastes like a cheap Rioja, and by the way, there's a mistake on the label that means it's not real. It's happened a few times, but actually, usually people, and they actually like to be told. I've learned, I used to keep quiet, but now I tell people, and actually they appreciate, and I explain why I think it's a fake, if that's true. Yeah, and just the rise of China. China's going to be, in the future, has a huge interest in wine. There's a growing domestic demand, and they have their own brands. And they're buying lots of chateau. When I was in Hong Kong last week, I learned of a really big potential sale. By mistake, she shouldn't have told me. And if this sale comes true, it will be the biggest Chinese purchase so far. But you're going to see a lot of, I'm sure, more Bordeaux chateau go into Chinese hands, and especially Burgundy. My own personal opinion is I don't mind who owns a property. I don't care whether it's French, English, Chinese, or Russian. It doesn't bother me. The only thing that bothers me is, does that person drink wine? And it annoys me when I hear of some famous domains, famous chateau owned by people that have no interest in wine. That's the only thing that annoys me. So I always ask, people, is this person interested in wine? And if so, then, money talks at the end of the day. In France, they don't like the idea of somebody from, say, China owning their historic properties, but at the end of the day, if you write a check out for 500 million euros, that's going to be sold. Because there's always shareholders behind that maybe aren't so interested, and they want to see the money in their bank. They don't care about the wine. It's always true. Nearly finished. And there's global economic effects. In the future, we're in a sort of bubble global economy, really. And we'll have to see if when I was in Hong Kong, I was with one of the top bankers who said the end is coming, which was a bit depressing. And it was interesting. He said, well, if it's going to happen, should you put your money into wine? Is it a safe haven for your money? And a lot of people feel that way. They don't want the money in the banks. They'll invest it in first growths and top wines, because if there was a big economic downturn, then wine is, the prices are very good. They'll stay high. There's only a limited supply of La Tour 82 or Le Pin. It's not like other commodities that there's a constant production. And so that's quite unique for wine. So I think you'll see a lot of people are investing in wine because times are good. But also I think if times, if the economies go down, I think wine will stay strong, because I think people will still want to put their money into wine. Oh, and that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil. It was very interesting, was it? How do you taste?
Oh, I did. I'll be very quick. Some people want to know how I do my job. So I'll tell you briefly. So basically, for example, when I do Bordeaux En-Primeur, I do a mixture of visits. Oh, good thing. So I do a mixture of visits and big tastings where I go to like a laboratory, like or a négociant, and taste 120, 130 wines in a day. It's very, very, very hard work. Oh, this is about Primeur. Okay, I'll explain a little bit about Primeur then. I'll be very quick. Some people think En-Primeur is very old. It's not. It started in around the 1960s. The winemaking then was sort of very simple, and there was no En-Primeur, really. And in the 60s and 70s, En-Primeur started in around the early 60s, mainly with the sort of 61 vintage. So Primeur selling unfinished wines in barrels to the merchant the spring after the harvest. And up until 1971, the chateau didn't have to bottle the wines. It could be the merchants like Berry Brothers, Van der Merlen in Belgium. From 1971, the chateau had to bottle the wines themselves. And in the 1970s, it was the merchants that really sold the wines En-Primeur. But of course, there was a kind of conflict of interest because they're selling the wine, and so they told all their customers that even the terrible wines were good. In the early 1970s, you had a lot of poor vintages, and there was no En-Primeur. It's kind of crazy to think of there being no Primeur, because nowadays it's every year, but in the 1970s, nobody was interested. Sorry. And then 1978, things started to change. Robert Parker published the first issue of the Wine Advocate, but some people think it was a big success immediately. It wasn't. Only people around Baltimore knew about it. And on the left here, that's the first ever issue of the Wine Advocate from 1978. If I remember rightly, I think Bob's wife typed the newsletter. And it was literally stapled together and sent to friends around in the local area. On the right-hand side is the most recent issue. It's recently been redesigned in color. But for a long time, it looked the same as the first issue. Just go on. And 1982 was the big turning point. For me, it's the modern age. Robert Parker became famous because he came out and praised the 82 vintage. Some people think he was the only person that did that. It's not quite true. There are some French critics that also praised it. But at the time, the most famous critic was a guy called, I think it was Richard Finnegan. And he did not like the 82 vintage. He said there's no structure, the wines are too soft, the wines are too fruity. But Robert Parker loved the wines. And in the end, Robert Parker, I guess, was proved right because they do taste fantastic. At the same time, he introduced the 100-point system, which was kind of easy to understand. You know, I don't speak any Russian, but if you said to me, I think this wine is 98 points, I know you like the wine. So I know how you're thinking. So the 100-point system became the universal system where that was used in publications like Wine Advocate, Wine Spectator. And in the 80s, you saw the right bank. People forget that even Pomerol did not have a great reputation until the 80s. Even Petrus was. I have a friend who had a restaurant, and his father only served Petrus from Monday to Friday because it was a cheap Merlot, and the weekend was for first growths. So he never served Petrus at weekend. So it's changed since then. I will drink Petrus every day. So, and at the same time, Chateau began investing in wineries, stainless steel tanks, investing in the vineyard, and so on. 80s, you had three great vintages. There was a big harvest in 89, and 1990 was also a great vintage. But people had bought the 89 and were not interested in the 90. So 90 was actually difficult to sell when the wines were released. Now the wines are very expensive and they're very highly regarded. But when the 1990 came out, it was not easy to sell. Then you had bad vintages 91 to 94. And then at this time, the power was with the merchants and the negociants and not the chateau. So they could say to the chateau, we're not going to take the wine at that price. And they dictated the market. And then I think that began to change in 95 and 96. En-Primeur became more important because Parker came out very strongly. You had the vin de garage, such as Valandro, very popular more in America than in Europe. And then this was followed by 97. I was in the trade in 97, so I remember this, but the 97s were an average vintage, but the prices were high because the Bordelais were becoming a little bit too confident in their wines, and nobody bought them. So it was a poor campaign. Oh, this is I started doing En-Primeur in 97, so I've done about 20 years, which is actually quite a long time. A lot of journalists have only done sort of 5 or 6 En-Primeurs, but I started in 97 when I didn't really know what I was doing, but I went down anyway to taste the wines, and that's the only way to learn. That's me tasting somewhere, concentrating very hard, very serious. Then turn of millennium, 2000 was an amazing vintage. But 2001 was the first vintage that wasn't rated by Robert Parker. He didn't go to Bordeaux because it was after 9/11. And I remember being with a famous négociant as the news came out that Robert Parker wasn't coming to Bordeaux. And to him, it was like the end of the world. It was like, oh my God, how can I sell the wines? We won't have scores. But in the end, it was okay, actually. I mean, the chateau had an idea, and I think in that year, people began to think, we can survive, you know, if Robert Parker doesn't come. And then in 2003 was the sort of infamous fight between Robert Parker and Jancis Robinson over the Pavie 2003. And for me, I thought what's interesting, it was the first time that social media sort of became important in discussing or debating or arguing about En-Primeur. And also it maybe highlighted the difference between palates in the US and Europe. And people still sort of talk about it. It got very acrimonious between the two, and I knew them both. So I actually got them back together in the end, and it's fine. It's fine now, they're friends. But around this time, the power moved away from the merchants, the negociants, back to the chateau, because the demand was increasing, as I've sort of said before. So now the power goes back to the chateau because they want the wine. So the chateau start dictating the prices, and they start manipulating the quantity that they release to the merchants. So you've got this big change in power, which again explains why prices have increased in recent years. And then 2005, I think, is a really important vintage. I think this is the year where wine changed from being something of a niche that a small percentage of people liked, and it became like the luxury item that lots of people wanted. And I think from 2005, you had people that never drank wine started investing in wine. And so this put more pressure on prices, and wine became more global. I think up until then, it was just in mainly Europe and in the US and a little bit in, say, Japan. But after that, you had, Hong Kong and other countries sort of get more interested. Even countries in Africa, it's amazing how much fine wine is sold in Africa. And a lot of champagne. And this, at the same time, you had Burgundy that became, I remember Burgundy was always the wine you would buy if you cannot afford Bordeaux. That's changed a bit. It's almost the opposite way around now. But Burgundy, I mean, when I started, I used to drink winemakers like Griveaux and Catillard and Angèle because they were cheap and I could afford them. Now I cannot afford them, and the bottles are maybe 10 times as expensive as 10 years ago. And then enter Hong Kong. Hong Kong has had a massive effect, and they removed the import duties completely in 2008, and this changed everything. So much fine wine is now traded through Hong Kong. And 2008 was quite interesting because it was when the wines started coming out, it was quite weak. And then Robert Parker released his scores, and I can remember, for example, Chateau Angelus, suddenly their price was 4 times as expensive. So it showed the sort of power of the publication. And that's me in Hong Kong, just with my colleague, Louis. And then we have 2009. I still think 2009 will be seen as the peak of En-Primeur, the most successful there will ever be. You had a great vintage. You had lots of scores from critics, including Robert Parker, who said, it's the best vintage he ever tasted. I think he gave 20 100-point scores. And you had intense demand from Hong Kong and from China, all at the same time. And so, millions and millions of pounds were sold En-Primeur that I think will never be seen again, in my opinion. And at the same time, that's when Lafite became the first of the first because of China. And I remember having to, I was asked to inspect 100 cases of Lafite 82 that was being sold to one person in China. I can't remember the value, but it was quite a lot. So, it was kind of a crazy time. And 2010 was a great vintage, but the Chinese began, they're not stupid, and they realized that they were the ones paying crazy prices, and they started to turn around and say, actually, we're going to say no, thank you very much. And so I think it was a short-term strategy in Bordeaux. They wanted to make as much money as quickly as possible, and they should have looked long-term to build the market gradually, but they didn't. Primeur no more, maybe. I mean, Château Latour withdrew from the En-Primeur in 2012, and they were the first major chateau not to release their wines En-Primeur. Have people followed? No, they haven't. So it suggests that maybe it was a mistake. Personally, I think it was a mistake. I think they should have stayed doing En-Primeur because you want to be part of the race. You want to be part of the beauty contest, as one chateau owner described it. And because it's not part of the beauty contest, then I think that the trade in Château Latour has fallen. Even though the wine is fantastic, I mean, I still think it's probably the greatest chateau in Bordeaux. But because Latour no longer takes part in Primeur, I think people's interest has gone down. Then you had 13, which was a really bad vintage. But the trouble is the prices didn't come down enough. When I was buying for the Japanese market in the 90s, I would have bought 2013 at a good price to sell to restaurants. But the prices stay expensive, and so the wine just stays in warehouses. And then 14 was the year I took over from Robert Parker to do En-Primeur. So I was in lots of newspapers and interviewed by the BBC. It was very, very, very strange. And then 15, 16, maybe the first great vintages on the post-Parker era. What I mean by that is, of course, Robert Parker is still here, but he's not reviewing Bordeaux anymore. And so they're the first vintages that I think are really fantastic vintages. I have seen that negotiants are beginning, to feel that the chateau have too much power, and they're just beginning to refuse allocations. Not all the time, but at the end of the day, it costs so much money that you cannot risk tying all your money, all your capital in a wine you cannot sell for a number of years. So I think it's just beginning to change. And a lot of merchants, instead of buying a lot of chateau in a good vintage, now they choose maybe 10, 12 chateau they think represent good value, and they will buy a lot. And the chateau that they feel do not represent good value, even if the wine is good, they buy nothing, like a zero. And it's really interesting. I see some merchants show me how much they sell of each chateau to the consumer. And it's amazing how many chateaux, the number of cases is zero. It's not even one, because there's no point in buying them. And so we'll see that more in the future. And then Brexit, of course, is another thing that does have an impact. It's already changed the currencies. So it means that En-Primeur is more difficult to sell. But if you have a mature vintage, it's cheaper if you sell it to Russia or the Far East. So there's been a big demand for older vintages, but of course that's not going to be long term. Eventually there will not be older vintages to sell, so it could be a problem. And then in the Far East, Burgundy is still the king. Everybody wants Burgundy. And it'll be interesting to see if this will continue, because I think they will just run out of wine. And I think they will go back either to Bordeaux or look for another country. But at the moment in the Far East, everybody is obsessed about Burgundy. So it will be interesting to see if this will continue. That's that one. Thank you very much.
After all these things and this beautiful presentation made by Nil, what do you feel? I'm thirsty, and what I need? A good bottle of Bordeaux. Thank you so much, Nil.
Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry. Thank you so much. К сожалению, мы вынуждены закрывать все наши уже прослушивания и пригласить вас на небольшие дегустации, которые наши коллеги подготовили. Благодарю весь коллектив компании Simple.